I'm Michael Brooks. I was the content curator for WGSI Learning 2030. My question is really, how do you, we were talking about long feedback time, so you get success in education through innovation and this kind of innovation, but it can take years before parents will see it, and actually it won't be the generation of parents that actually invested in it effectively, but it'll be the next generation that can see the success. How do you build the trust, because to get the take-up for this kind of thing when the feedback cycle is so long?
Well, that's a question, I guess I want to say, because I think there are two answers, both of which are accurate. One is that the process that we are seeing now is very rapid. The feedback is built in. It's rapid. We filmed 3 schools in Ontario recently, and they're also going to be released on Wednesday, 3 10-minute narratives. And these schools were, all 3 of them, where 3 years ago the students and the teachers were bored and alienated. It's a terrible place to work, terrible place to be. I describe these schools as, what kind of school do you have if almost all the people there would rather be somewhere else that particular hour? So that's what we saw. 3 years later, we had no trouble capturing the dynamism and the success and the multiplicity of feedback that not only they gave each other, but the parents and the school district has 246 schools. One of the districts was like incredibly fast. So I think all of the things we know in John's work on visible learning and visible teaching, John Hattie's work, which has where the feedback is rapid and regular. So I think the most fundamental answer to your question is the very learning process has rapid, regular feedback that's transparent and externally available as well as internally, and therefore you don't have to wait and see. You'll know in real time. Then I think the other answer is closer to your worry, is that in a kind of proven sense, when you add it all up, and when you think that the change really so fundamental, for example, the way that teachers have to conduct learning, is it so fundamental that it's going to take a long, long time for the teaching force to get that good? Then that's more of a worry, I think, because then you get that. So our satisfaction, at least, is around the first answer. We know it can happen rapidly and that it can happen on a pretty good scale, and there'll be a lot of satisfaction built in as part and parcel of that. So, yeah, I just continue to worry about it. So let me put this in the language of strategy. Mostly the same points, but when you strategize, and we learned this in a sense in Ontario, when we used to write, and we still do some of this, you write a book or an article about it, you capture the narrative. We did this, we did that. These are the 8 key ingredients. So I started to write Ontario as a narrative, and then I would write it as a strategy, which was a different version, but the same phenomenon. So you can. This is writing it as strategy. So here I think are the key things this week. The cycle. And this is in our Rich Seam paper. These 3 parts: directional vision, which is a bit like Andy's inspiring destination; directional vision, letting go, which is the the non-judgmental learning, encouragement, innovation, and reining in. Whereas and it's not 1, 2, 3 because it's happening in real time. All 3 of those, but this is kind of the change process we see, so that the cycle has to be, to a degree, controlled but not over-controlled. It's got to have a looseness in it, but also you have to have the ability to rein in the looseness. So this isn't a new idea. It's like a divergence-convergence combination. You diverge in order to converge better around the ideas that are settling in. So I think this is the learning flow, that cycle, to think of it that way. And here, in the letting go we're working in a big district, Peel district, which has 246 schools, and they're doing this. But at the letting go phase, which we thought was only going to be good because people are innovating, it also was a time for certain leaders to introduce their pet projects. anything goes, so they kind of use the vacuum to do that. So you want to have, I guess we've used the phrase focused innovation, which is means that there's some letting go. It's innovative, but it's focused in a way that you're actually pursuing something in order to discover it and capture it and not put limits on it, but it has a degree of focus. So that's one. I think I have about 7 of these, let's say maybe 8. A second one is develop a commonly owned plan for success. And this is commonly owned as the agreement. This is about the strategy and the agreement. So we're seeing this in a lot of our leadership studies that, and we call in our leadership studies where we tend to talk these days about push and pull. Leaders have to be pushy and pulley. If you're a pushy leader, work on your pulliness. If you're a pulley leader, work on your pushiness. And actually, you have to do both of those. So a challenge of the status quo is pushy. This is pulley. And this is, if you think about, the key here is shared plan. So you want to have people that in the 1,000 schools, let's say, the leaders that are within it and around it, is that they have, the commonly owned plan is a commitment to, the strategy is commonly owned as well as the goals and the outcomes. So people have to know the strategy. We call it talk the walk. If you get lots and lots of people who can explain the strategy consistently to each other and to externals, then you know you have a commonly owned strategy as well as a plan. So that's the second one. Third one, formulate skinny implementation plans. This is coming from our language of, the skinny of change, which is too many people go for the complex plan. The complex plan, I call it striving for complexity and achieving clutter. So you end up with a complex plan, but you can't really be used. And I like to use just regular language for this or examples. One district we work with in Eastern Ontario, the superintendent called me and said, we're using lots of your ideas, and yet people are getting tired. They're burning out. I'm afraid we're going to give up. We're losing them. He said, could you come and take a look and work with us? So I asked him to send us the district plan, and he did, and it was 31 pages long. It had 16 goals. It had 8 things across the matrix about who does what, resources, etc. You could read it and find it actually perfectly rational as I read it. But then I asked myself, like if I go out and I ask any given 5 principals or 5 teachers, tell me about the district plan, what are my chances of getting any clarity or specificity? They're almost nil. So we asked him to reduce it to 3 goals. And they had no trouble doing that. And we did 6 sessions with them. They had been stuck on literacy, high school graduation for 4 years. The next year, they jumped 8% in literacy across. This was a district with 42 schools. So they actually, all we did was help them focus and help them understand the plan and embrace the plan. So the plan is something that is, it's sticky, it's alive, it's actionable. It's all those things, and if it's not actionable, and actually our single guideline for this, which actually opens it up quite readily, is that when you start thinking about the implementation plan, what you should think fundamentally is the implementation plan, strangely enough, is not for the planners, it's for the implementers. So the planners can please themselves, but if you're not pleasing the implementers, you don't have a skinny implementation plan. So that's, you want to simplify it in that kind of language. Communicate during implementation. This is another one of our, when we do the workshops, there's more to this than just those 3 words. It's about, I'll put it this way, it's more important to communicate during implementation than it is to communicate prior to implementation. Prior to implementation is important because you don't want people to gang up on you and not let you get started. But I'm thinking about impact of communication. The impact of communication, there's lots of ways in which we've seen this, is really coming because people are communicating during implementation, not because they had a lot of communication before they did something. It counts when you do it during implementation because 2 things are accomplished. One is the vision gets sharper, because you're communicating about real things, what you're doing. And the other is you have a lot of, and so you have an opportunity to articulate the vision and reinforcing, be more specific about it. And the other thing that's important is you solve problems. People are communicating what's working, what's not working. So problem solving is built in to the two-way communication during this. Identify, spread what is being learned. This is now I'm talking strategy. We already said that earlier, but we're saying what are your strategies to do this, to communicate what's being learned to those that are within the learning, but also to others that you want to be part of this. Give opportunities for people to talk the walk. I mentioned that about the strategy. When we go to a place that claims to be successful, all you have to do is go into 2 different schools and say, tell us about the strategy being learned. And if you get generalized or inconsistent responses, you know that it's actually not working. But if you get consistent, specific responses on the same page, 2 different schools or 5 different schools, you'll know that. And I would say that about your clusters. If you have a cluster of, if it's 20 schools in Tasmania or 80 in Victoria, one indicator for me a year and a half from now is if I go into 5 of those 80 schools, 5 different ones, and I ask individual teachers to tell me about, or students for that matter these days, tell me about the strategy, we will get specificity and clarity. That's when you know you've accomplished this. Partner externally for wider learning and dissemination, obvious, and this is really how we've designed it. So those, I think there's a full list here, yeah. So that's the list of thinking about it as a strategy. So I'd say just in closing that all I've done is kind of warm us up a little bit in terms of the conception. This is not the definitive plan. Clearly there's so many pieces of it, but they all are part of the next 2 days and the next 3 years. So lots of opportunity to get it right. So I'll leave that slide up and I'll turn it over to Joanne.